The room burst into laughter the moment my husband leaned into the microphone. "She keeps the trains running," he said, nodding toward me. A throwaway joke to them, yet to me. It was a blade twisted in the same wound I'd carried for years. I sat there, smiling like a good wife, while inside every nerve screamed. I had orchestrated midnight airlifts, rerouted convoys through hurricanes, stopped cyber attacks before Wall Street ever knew it was under fire. Yet all they saw was an office clerk. My name is Serenia Locke, and that night, under the chandeliers and polite applause, something inside me snapped. The silence I'd chosen for years was about to end. Crystal light spills off the SR-71 Blackbird hanging above the room, while a brass medley smooths over small talk. I keep to the wall in a navy trench, fingers tight around a small leather notebook, the one that holds more truth than any toast tonight. The MC calls Adrian Cole to the stage to honor his logistics contribution. Chairs scrape, cameras rise. Across our table, Walt leans back in his marine cut suit and says to the man beside him, loud enough to cross the linen and land, "Office clerk in a uniform." The words don't surprise me. They never do. They just find the same old scar and press. I watch the bourbon swirl in his glass instead of his eyes. Sunday dinners in Tacoma slide through my head in fast cuts, plates passed over me, stories that stop when I enter, a laugh that says, "Sit down and be quiet." I swallow it the way I always have. Straight, no chase. My phone buzzes once against my palm. Encrypted text from SOC. JBLM. Ransomware payload staging. ETA 6EH. Advise. The air tightens. Music and applause fade to a hum as muscle memory takes over. Assess, isolate, act. A second buzz. From Harper. Board approved. Brigadier General select. If tonight stays clean, it can go public. I breathe in, slow and even. The trench suddenly feels heavier, like a shell I've outgrown. I straighten from the wall and lift my head toward Walt. He's still talking, still certain of his place in this room and mine in the shadows. I let the silence stretch just long enough to choose. Tonight won't end the way he thinks. At 3 a. m. In a storm that rattled the roof. I sat in the SOC with a headset digging into my temples and a flight plan on hold. Air traffic control wouldn't clear the corridor. The hurricane bands were closing. I argued altitude, fuel, and minutes like they were lives, because they were. When the screen finally flashed green, I wrote it down the way I always do. Flight rerouted, 245 patients alive. Another night, another wall of blue data. One vendor invoice blinked a hair off, milliseconds out of rhythm. Nobody else smelled it. I did. Days later, 6 agencies were shoulder to shoulder, and a West Coast banking collapse died before it could take its first breath. On Sundays in Tacoma, none of that existed. Ruth slid ribs onto my plate and smiled. "You must be tired from office work." Walt cut in without looking up. "Sitting at a computer isn't soldiering." I swallowed mashed potatoes and said the only safe thing, doing fine. The missions I couldn't name pressed against my ribs and stayed there. Between meetings, I reopened an old vendor report. A timestamp didn't line up with the actual airlift manifests, off just enough to matter. I marked the page in red. Potential staging ground? The room had no windows, but I could feel a draft, like something had left the door cracked and dared me to push it open. Last year's gala still lives in the soft part of my jaw. Adrian grinned into the mic. "My wife keeps the trains running." The room laughed like it was harmless. I gave them half a smile and carried the rest home, where it echoed for months in the quiet places. I started writing what didn't fit anywhere else. 2300 HRs. Eau de parfum, not mine. Invoice mismatch. Denver versus Chicago. Crisp lines. No adjectives. Just the truth. Filed like a classified brief. I didn't confront. I collected. In operations, you don't kick in a door without a floor plan. When the vendor emails finally mapped, a name surfaced where it shouldn't have. His. Tucked into headers. CCs. Calendar crumbs. The notebook shifted in my hands. Heavier than gossip. lighter than fear. It wasn't a ledger of a marriage anymore. It was a route overlay, arrows, timing marks, and a red X forming on the page. The SOC glowed in low light, rows of monitors washing the room in electric blue. Warning lights pulsed red across the dashboard, logs scrolling faster than most eyes could follow. I leaned in, chasing one anomaly to the next, until the trail circled back to a vendor invoice I had already flagged. Its timestamp was off by just enough to matter, and when I ran it against server traffic, the line curved straight toward a test rig sitting in Denver. Cross-checks confirmed what instinct had already whispered. Buried in the packet was ransomware. Dormant but primed, like a landmine under glass. Every thread I pulled tightened the knot, and all of them pointed back to the same vendor, the one Adrian's contracts kept circling. My chest tightened, not with surprise, but with the sick symmetry of it. The quiet notes I had written about hotel bills, perfume, and misplaced hours now bled into the same page as malware and system exploits. My private betrayal and a public threat had folded into one. Scrolling through the vendor's internal chatter, a line stopped me cold. Trains on time. It was his phrase, Adrian's, the one he had used to reduce me to a punchline at last year's gala. Seeing it here was like watching his voice caught on tape in a crime scene. Hours later, Ruth called, breezy as always, bragging about the luxury trip Adrian had treated her to. She mentioned it came from the company's dime. I froze, pen already in hand, and wrote, "Conflict of interest, misuse." I opened the notebook wider, drew 2 columns, Adrian, vendor, anomalies, line after line matched up in cruel symmetry. The page stared back at me with one question I could no longer ignore. Was he only betraying me, or was he betraying the system itself? The next morning, I walked into a windowless conference room at JBLM. Notebook under my arm. Major General Harper waited, silver hair sharp under the fluorescence, eyes cutting like searchlights. I laid out the report, the vendor, the timestamps, the email trail that bent too close to Adrian's orbit. Harper listened, hands folded, then leaned forward. "If you want them to pin that star where they never thought you'd stand, make damn sure there isn't a live threat crawling under the floorboards. No surprises left running." Then he slid a file across the table. My name was printed bold at the top. "You didn't apply," he said, "but your work has been noticed. 8 months ago, I submitted this, the hurricane flights, the bank breach. You've been on the board's desk ever since." The air shifted. I hadn't asked, hadn't even dreamed of it. And yet, here it was, the proof that the invisible work had carried weight after all. My pulse hammered against my collar, as if my body knew before my mind could process. Later that day, a call from a statehouse aide cut through the haze. He laughed when my name came up, an office clerk climbing too high. It landed the same way Walt's voice had, only sharper, reminding me the dismissals stretched far beyond a single-family table. Back in the room, Harper caught my expression and let a smile crease the corner of his mouth. "Let them underestimate you," he said softly. "It'll make the reveal sweeter." When he left, I stayed. Alone with the notebook and my reflection in the polished wall, I studied the uniform on my shoulders. The mirror showed both versions of me, the wife who had been sidelined and the officer standing at the edge of a fault line. For the first time, I let myself believe those two could fracture into something new. The chandeliers above painted a golden shimmer across the white linen tables, champagne glasses catching every flicker of light. I sat among the guests, smile fixed in place, while in my right ear the hidden earpiece whispered chaos. The young cadet I had once mentored sounded far too steady for someone her age. "Payload ransomware scheduled for 600 Monday. If it isn't removed, the entire regional banking grid will lock down." I lifted my glass, clinked it politely, with a kernel across the table, and let out a laugh that matched his. On the surface, I was another guest enjoying jazz and wine. Inside, I was counting seconds, watching a different kind of clock tick down. It was like living in split screen, velvet music and champagne flutes on one side, a digital storm tearing through circuits on the other. Then the cadet's next report tightened the knot. The kill switch was tethered to a single device, Adrian's personal laptop. Vendor logs confirmed it. My fork paused midair, but I forced it down as if nothing had happened. A cluster of guests behind me whispered just loud enough, "She's only ever done office work." The words dug like glass, but before I could breathe it in, Walt's voice cut through, flat and hard. "She's served more than any of you will ever know." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. For the first time, the wall of his silence cracked. I closed my eyes for one long beat. On one side, malware seconds away from ignition. On the other, a man who had finally spoken up for me after years of disdain. The ice that had held both my life and my family in place was beginning to fracture. The back corridor of the gala smelled faintly of roses and expensive cologne. Shadows stretched long under the amber lights, muffling the music from the ballroom. Adrian was already reaching for his phone when I stepped in front of him. "Do you have access to the vendor's test rig?" My voice was quiet, but sharp enough to cut. He froze, eyes sliding sideways, fingers tapping the phone like it could shield him. The cologne rose stronger as he shifted closer to the wall, the same scent I'd logged weeks ago in my notebook. His lips moved, half denial, half excuse, but I didn't wait to hear it. In my ear, the cadet broke in. "Found the kill switch. It matches, ma'am. It's your old code signature." My stomach dropped. 3 years ago, I had written that sequence for a security prototype. Now it had been twisted into a weapon. The cadet's voice sharpened. "We've stripped it out. Payload neutralized. All systems clear." I stood silent as Harper's call came through, his voice heavy with certainty. "The field is clean. Command and the governor are ready. If you want the star, they'll pin it tonight, right there, in front of them all." The hallway seemed to tilt as the weight of my trench coat pressed on my shoulders, heavier than any metal I'd ever worn. I drew in a slow breath. The shell had done its job, kept me hidden long enough. It was time to shed it. The Museum of Flight shimmered under crystal chandeliers, every reflection dancing across the polished floor and the black steel of the SR-71 Blackbird suspended above. The gala had reached its comfortable lull, the audience settling back with the satisfaction of a program finished. Chairs scraped, murmurs rose, waiters moved toward the doors with trays of champagne. Then the MC lifted the microphone again. His voice carried a weight that sliced through the chatter. "Before we close, we have one final unscheduled recognition." A ripple of confusion swept the room. Guests paused mid-stand, some turning with faint irritation, others curious. I felt my pulse steady as I rose. My hands moved with deliberate calm to the trenchcoat buttons. Each snap released felt like an echo chamber collapsing, until the last one gave way and the coat slid from my shoulders, falling in a hushed whisper onto the stone floor. Gasps flared. The white service dress beneath caught the chandelier light, blazing in stark contrast. At my collar gleamed 2 silver stars. For a suspended beat, the entire room seemed to forget how to breathe. A glass shattered somewhere near the back, the sound too sharp against the silence. Adrian froze, lips parted in an unfinished word, his eyes locked on mine as though he'd never seen me before. Walt's knuckles whitened around the arm of his chair, his usual smirk erased, leaving him emptied of certainty. Even Ruth's hands fluttered to her mouth, as if she could hold in disbelief. I began to walk. Each step echoed with the click of my heels against marble, precise, unhurried, deliberate. The trench behind me lay discarded, the shell I no longer needed. The MC's voice followed, resonant and clear. "Brigadier General Serenya Locke." General Harper stood waiting at the podium. When I reached him, he took my hand firmly, then pinned the stars with the kind of grip that said both acknowledgement and solidarity. The weight settled on my collar, cool against my skin, heavier in meaning than in mass. Applause rose hesitantly at first, scattered claps breaking the silence, until it gathered momentum. Row by row, the audience stood, their ovations swelling into a thunder that filled the hall. My chest rose, but I did not smile. I let the sound wash over me, not as validation, but as a marker that the years of silence had ended. When I spoke, my voice cut through the applause without strain. Strategy is not soft. Logistics is not background. Behind every medal, there are names you'll never know, people who built the bridge in the dark so others could cross into the light. You don't need a rifle to serve. Sometimes all you need is a spine of steel. The room held its breath in the space that followed, then broke again into applause, louder than before, as though the truth of it had reached them deeper than the ceremony alone. I let the sound carry on without rushing to fill it. When I finally turned my gaze outward, I locked eyes with them, Adrian still pale and silent, Ruth trembling with emotion, and Walt, rigid but unable to look away. For the first time, it was not me shrinking under their judgment. It was them forced to see me as I had always been, and I stood there, stars blazing at my collar, letting them reckon with the reality they could no longer deny. The air in the side room still carried the tang of champagne and perfume, though the party outside had already swallowed the evidence. A single lamp cast a pool of amber across the wooden table, draped in a wrinkled white cloth. I set my leather notebook down in the center, the sound of its spine striking the wood louder than it should have been. When the Inspector General leaned forward, I opened it without ceremony. Pages of tidy handwriting stared back. Misaligned invoices, timestamps that defied the flight logs, email chains that repeated themselves like ghosts. Alongside them, my quieter notes, eau de parfum, not mine. Hotel charge, Denver versus Chicago. Each line cataloged with the same precision I used in classified briefs. What had once been fragments of suspicion now formed a complete ledger. The door creaked, and Adrian entered. His face had none of the charm he wore on stage. He looked pale, older, eyes rimmed in defeat. For a long moment, he just stared at the notebook, as though its contents might vanish if he willed it hard enough. Then he whispered, voice frayed, "Don't bring down the whole company. There are people who will lose their jobs, families. They're innocent." I let the words hang, not because I doubted them, but because I wanted him to hear the silence that followed. Then I said, calm and even, "I protect them, but you are not on that list." He flinched like I had struck him. The Inspector General made a small note in the margin of his file, eyes never leaving me. I reached into my bag, pulled out the wedding ring I had kept tucked in a pocket of my wallet. For years it had been weightless, just another object I carried out of habit. Tonight, it was lead. I placed it on the open notebook, the metal catching the lamplight, before coming to rest atop the record of his betrayals. No shouting, no pleading, no theater. The marriage ended the way my service had always been carried out, in silence, but with finality. The Inspector General closed the file with a firm nod. He didn't need speeches. The evidence spoke for itself. Across from me, Adrian slid into a chair, shoulders collapsing inward, staring at the ring as if it were a verdict. For the first time, he looked small. For the first time, he understood the power no longer sat in his hands. 6 months later, the garage in Tacoma glowed under the buzz of a single fluorescent tube. Against the far wall stood a glass cabinet that hadn't been there before. Inside, carefully arranged, was a photograph of me the night I was pinned with my stars, the medal itself resting beside it. Next to both sat a neatly folded flag from Walt's own service. He stood a few feet away, arms stiff at his sides, eyes fixed on the display. For a long moment, he said nothing, then his voice cracked just slightly. I wasted too many years before I saw it clear. I met his gaze, steady and calm. My worth was never yours to decide, but I do respect the change. The silence between us was no longer hostile. It felt like an old wound stitched, if not healed. Later, driving toward the Bremerton ferry. The night wind carried salt through the open window. Across the water, the city glittered, and the Space Needle pierced the darkness like a lighthouse. My phone buzzed with a message from the cadet who had stood with me in the S-Oak. "I didn't know we could be that." I typed back, "Go, do it." The fairy lights shimmered across the waves, scattering into silver trails. I whispered into the night, words meant for anyone who had ever been sidelined. Never mistake being overlooked for being irrelevant. When it's your time, step into the light, steady, certain, and without asking permission.